Hey Shai, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again. I hope you're not bored by me by now.
No, I plan another 10 sessions with you, to
I
to
can
cover
talk
the.
for another 10. It just
Yeah,
never
let's
ends.
see. Do you remember the most important question from last time, the overflow question?
Yeah, how did we come to the name Codename 1? Which
Exactly.
is, I think, a funny story that kind of goes to a lot of the subjects I'm talking about. So it was sort of a random thing because when we started shopping around the idea of Codename 1, we wanted to raise funding. So Chen and I talked to two other friends, which I'll leave nameless, although they're fine, they're
Hmm.
decent people, but eventually they ended up not being part of Codename 1. And we wanted them to essentially be our more business-like partners. And one of them was supposed to be the CEO. He already founded a company before, so we thought, and he had the right type of connections and everything, and he was very good at that. Another one was an MBA, although both of them very technical. So it was a really good match on paper. So we went to practically every VC in the country, and that former founder wasn't able to get any funding, and he insisted that we must go with a VC and can't go with angels, all sorts of things like that. That's one of the reasons I think I later on failed, because he kind of convinced me that we needed to go with VCs. Anyway, we repeatedly failed, and
Okay, now to,
eventually,
to listeners and all not business and no savvy people, what's the difference between VC and angels?
okay, sorry. VC is a venture capital firm. It's essentially an organization with a specific structure that's meant to fund you, and they're built in a very interesting way of sort of uh, capital is promised by the limited partners, which, despite their name, are the actual people and organizations with money.
Hmm.
And there's lots of complexities regarding what's venture capital, and in some degrees, some angels are cross into that line, and vice versa at a certain scale. But generally, venture capital is considered much larger, and larger companies need money from VCs because you'd want to grow and you need continued investments. Angels have this sort of glass ceiling to a lesser degree nowadays, but back then it was more pronounced, where of funding. And being backed only by angels essentially puts a limit on the size that you can grow. So angels have a lot of advantages over VCs because it's usually just a person or a small group of people who literally write you a check. So you're meeting the person who actually has the money at some point, where a
Hmm.
VC is sort of you're meeting an organization that makes a calculated risk. Eventually, it's
Hmm.
some person who signs the check, but still, it's not their money. They need to show accountability. They have all sorts of constraints. An angel is just a person who can make a judgment call at the end of the day. And in many regards, it's easier to raise money from angels. It's also a much smaller check in
Hmm.
most cases. So we looked at the amount on the check and decided that angels were probably not for us, because back then, those days, angels would give you hundreds of thousands of dollars at most,
Hmm.
and VCs easily gave you over $1 million to start. And today, these numbers have nothing to do with, when I worked with lightrun, they raised from an angel at, I think, $3.7 million. So the numbers today are very different than they were back then. And that's just the 10-year difference.
Hmm.
So we went to practically every VC in the country and essentially got a sort of rejection. VCs rarely actually reject you because uh, it's kind of like a dating game sort of situation where you need
Hmm.
to sort of woo the VC and convince them that you're in demand, that you're the hot new startup. and they need to chase you, and you're doing them a favor by taking their money. And the first round was obviously lots of fishing and nothing on the hook. And the guy that was the CEO I think he grew cold over that. And we decided to part ways. But one of the pivotal moments in that process was because of the name. So when we started, we needed to create a presentation for investors, and I was responsible for that, for the whole process. And you obviously need a name for the company on the slides. So I said, okay, we need to find a code name for during development. So I wrote code name, obviously. And since this was, the number one, so I wrote one, just code name one. I just just as a temporary thing, not an actual name of a company, because, obviously it won't be the actual name. We'll name it later on. And we showed it to VCs and everything, and most of them were okay. They didn't really even discuss it all that much. And one of them, at a relatively later point, said, "Oh, that's a great name. Did you grab it?" And up until that point, we didn't even actually think about grabbing the URL for that, because we didn't really think of it as the name. So we didn't bother. But that partner essentially said, no, obviously it's already, everything's taken, every permutation, codename one dot that, this and the other. And all sorts of, sort of made that up, even though none of us knew, because we didn't think. So we were literally in that session with the VCs, and I checked, and it was all available. And, it's something that's so easily verifiable. And he just pulled it out like that. And that sort of soured him on us to some degree, at least on me. Because, it's saying, oh, I'm an idiot, I didn't even think about checking that, as something... I know it goes sometimes against
the VC guy, right? This was a VC guy.
The VC guy asked about the name, and the person who was supposed to be our CEO said, "Oh, it's all taken up already. There's no codename. It's not available. Codename one." And I checked, and not only codename one as one a word or one a number, both of them were available in a .com, which was amazing, but it was. So I instantly grabbed them, obviously. And but also it kind of created some of friction between me and that CEO, supposed CEO, because I understand why he did that. He didn't want to seem like an idiot, which we all felt like idiots because we didn't even check if that name was available. But, it's not a big deal because we didn't think that would be the name. So it's not really. But grabbing the domain name of your code name is kind of like a 101 situation. Just kind of do it. And
but I mean, what I don't understand usually, right? What I would do in the CEO case, you could even online check the name, right? I could say,
he was talking.
I could say, no, codename one. This was just, this was an accident. Let's double check that and we grab it right now. It would be actually a cool situation, right?
Yeah. So he didn't want to show ignorance. And I'm always for showing ignorance. I mean,
but
I think
this is not ignorance. This is cool situation, right? Because this codename one was in the templates on the slide. So you could actually say, hey, this is actually a placeholder, and the other one says, okay, but this is a great name. It's like, oh, cool. Then let's make the placeholder to a name.
Yeah,
right? So
that's exactly my thought.
Yeah.
That's what I did. I grabbed the name on the spot, but I didn't want to embarrass him in front of the VC because he just lied about it. He said it was all taken.
And how it happened that the codename one was on the slide? Because it was on purpose as placeholder
I just made that up. Yeah, I placed it as a placeholder name, sort of, because codename
and the CEO didn't know that,
people use that. And he knew that. He knew that exactly. He just didn't really... It didn't occur to us to use that as the name of the company.
Yeah, but you could just say
something that was just a placeholder. Yeah. It was sort of a placeholder that became the name. And the fact that it was available, it was pretty shocking to all of us. Because we assumed, probably taken because every name is taken. And I guess it wasn't the most obvious name possible. And, one of the first companies, when I started...
But the codename one is great name. It's a really nice name. Yeah, if I saw this is really, I don't know why, this is like, how it's called, the president's Air Force One, right?
Yeah. One of the first companies when I started, when I created the BBS, I called it Seventh Segment. And I wanted to build a company based on that name. So when it actually came a time to start a company way before that, and years before even my consulting company, I thought, wait, I need to grab a domain, which was relatively early in the days of the internet. It wasn't something automatic. Turns out Seventh Segment was taken by practically everyone. Every permutation of Seventh Segment was taken. And the amusing part is one of the Seventh Segment, I don't remember if it was .com or some other, there was a guy and there was a picture of the guy. Back then people put the picture of the person who owned the domain in the domain. And the guy looked just like me.
Okay.
Which showed me, how conformist we all are in our field. We even look the same.
Yeah.
And, same ideas, same thoughts, everything.
Maybe you attended a conference. This was an older conference before Devox. The name was 33 Degrees. And I also like the name. It was like a really interesting, great name for a conference. And I asked why, and I think it was a science fiction movie or something. So I asked, the organizer, because the name was a catchy name, and they renamed it to Devox, which is a bit boring, but yeah. And this was nice. And I told you a similar story. I tell you a similar story, but not with no outcome, basically, but it's funny. I also already told it on the podcast, but in early days I created a CMS system with servlets based, and I don't know whether you remember San Francisco framework. You heard about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was from IBM. There were books about it. I remember still patents from the framework, like key and keyable. It were like accounting patents. And back then, San Francisco framework was like a nice thing to have in e-commerce space. So what I did, I measured the performance of servlets. And what I did, I noticed that inheritance has an impact on early Java performance and synchronizes the impact. So what I did, I created a servlet with methods which were synchronized and final. And to recognize that in the version number during load tests, and what I did, it was like version 1 SF, synchronized final. And I was always a freelancer, so I spent time in other projects, came back, and everyone talked about San Francisco version. And we were actually two people who built the entire system. So there was no one else. And I say, what do you mean by San Francisco? Okay, obviously we have San Francisco version. Because this SF was visible to marketing. And someone asked in a meeting, what is actually SF? And a marketing guy said, obviously, it is San Francisco edition. And then we had to implement the connector afterwards, which was not, actually, there was no point of using this. And we did it somehow, but this was my story with SF. And in the same project, it was also interesting, I said or wrote, I cannot remember, that we could call our system Star Portal, because there was Star Office, back then, and Star Money and whatever. And I would say, okay, Star Portal, cool name. And the PM or marketing guy misunderstood me and understood Star Bottle, like a bottle, not portal, bottle with water in it. And as you remember, Star Bottle, he back then was genie in a bottle. And the conclusion was
Star Bottle?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to say Star Portal. He understood Star Bottle. Yeah. And then he presented Star Bottle as a name. I didn't care, but I was like, why Star Bottle? I thought we were building a portal. And there were some Java developers in the meeting say, Bottle? Are you using Genie, Java Intelligent Network Infrastructure? And he looked at me, and I looked away, right? And I say, of course. And I was like, oh man. And then we had to integrate Genie in this framework. So this was actually the two stories, which were my mistake, but it I think this is really funny because this SF San Francisco back then, everything was San Francisco. And Genie was also very, very interesting technology for everyone, and almost forgotten right now. I asked my guests, "Do you know Genie?" And the technology was actually it is I still stealing ideas from Genie, like leasing, resource leasing, and stuff is still great right now. But it's a complete different topic. We should back on track, to Codename 1. And we covered the story. I had a question because I look at Codename 1. What is the latest version do you support? It's just Java 11, I think, right?
Java 8, actually, in terms of language support. Java 11 is the JDK that we build on top. So you can have Java 11 installed, but libraries are at a subset of Java 8 in terms of functionality, which is, I write a lot about newer versions of Java and the capabilities of Java. I actually have a book coming up about Java between 8 and 21 that I'm close to finishing. Yeah,
very good.
Just close to finishing it. And I love the new features, lots of them. But for mobile programming, there isn't all that much there that someone can really benefit from on mobile. And the size difference is records doesn't make a difference for mobile because you don't have JPA or things like that. You don't have reflection. You can't really do all that much with it. Maybe serialization, but instead in Codename 1 we have something called properties, which is something that I essentially created back in the day as a result of a discussion on the JavaLobby, and later on the guys in JavaFX sort of copied some of my ideas from there. Where, I actually contributed them. I had discussions with Richard over email, and essentially they took some of my ideas from there. And properties are kind of better than records for most things that we would need. Like they provide seamless serialization to XML or JSON or stuff like that to database without all the reflection problems that would come, or bytecode generation. So, and they're still relatively terse, not as terse as records, but still. And they support mutability and everything if you want it. And and that's
this is Java was curious. So you are not planning to support Java 17 after you finish all your books?
So we see a path ahead to do that because there's some tools similar to Retro Lambda that exist to porting newer versions of Java back. I'm not sure if we want to go down that rabbit hole though.
Okay.
Right now, Java 8 is fine for that particular use case. And if there is huge demand, obviously.
What I thought a desktop, right, could be interesting.
Well, desktop is the same sort of thing as mobile for us. It's mobile first, then desktop. So I don't think someone will pick Codename 1 to build desktop applications. I thought will pick Codename 1 to build, but to build something that's mobile first, then desktop.
Okay.
Because that's basically, and I think desktop development directly is dead as a result of lots of things. It's also the frameworks that are available, but also it's kind of a chicken and egg problem that people prefer web applications for desktop for most cases. There are special cases, but then usually people pick native development over Java or cross-platform. So
you mentioned JavaLobby. I completely forgot about JavaLobby. What happened to them? I mean, they are not around. DZone. Okay,
DZone is JavaLobby. It evolved into that. It's essentially the same group of people. Took the code of JavaLobby, sort of did an actual rewrite to some degree. And even today, DZone, I still have the same user ID from JavaLobby, which is like, I think, 700 or 900, something like that. So it still appears there in some of the options somewhere, the legacy, because I was very early on in the JavaLobby stuff. So, I was very active in the forums there. I don't know where all that went.
I was active at the beginning. They asked me whether I could work with them. So I got even a t-shirt at the beginning, I remember. And what happened then was they pick my blog entries and published them as on DZone. I was the author still, but the problem was that there were lots of comments on DZone, and I never saw them because I had no time, to scan constantly DZone. And then people were angry because I never answered, the comments. And I said, okay, we shouldn't do this because I cannot just scan, the DZone. And then I stopped,
Yeah, it's the MVB program.
MVP, yeah. Exactly. And I said yes. I didn't understood what happened. I didn't care my blog because I never had ads or something on that. But, the fact that I didn't want to make people angry because there were some heated discussions and I never saw them because I cannot. Maybe I looked once a day at DZone, but I had no time to constantly search for the comments on the posts. So and then I said,
they
okay,
improved there a bit. They have now you get an email when there's a comment. It's actually a bit verbose because it doesn't really contain the specific comments, so you need to actually go into the article and look at the comments. So it's not a great thing, but it works.
Yeah, okay, so, but for me, I was mainly consultant. That the articles were just fun if I was, in trains. I did something, and otherwise I just worked. So this was not the right, medium for me. So interesting. So JavaLobby became. This is what actually they're missing. But DZone appeared, but I didn't recognize that JavaLobby disappeared. So Java blocks also disappeared, but Java blocks was also huge back then. Yeah. Interesting.
Or Java.net, all of that stuff.
Yeah, Java.net, of course, but Java blocks was not Sun. I think it was Atlassian behind, and there's a huge Java block aggregator, which was nice. Everyone, this was actually the morning routine to look what's up with Java and Java blocks. Okay. Yeah. We should refocus again, otherwise we will meet, every week, the entire year. So, okay, I got you. Yeah. So, it makes sense. It's a complete different focus of Codename. It's mobile first, so I understand fully, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So now, what I also did now, I took a look at your debug agent stuff, and you're writing a lot of stuff. Maybe we should cover a bit what's inside the debug agent book, at least the beginning today. So, how you got idea to write the book? This is always interesting. How you got the idea to write a book about debugging?
So, in 2019, did I talk about joining lightrun and all of that stuff?
What joining?
Joining lightrun and all of that stuff.
No.
Did I talk about that?
No.
So, in 2019, the former CEO of the SIDC, the Sun Israel Development Center, contacted me, and he said by then he left quite a while back, and he had an investment with this young startup, and back then didn't have a name, called them Athena or something like that. And he said, meet the guys. There are two guys, nothing else, working at a WeWork, and he asked me to meet them, and I met up with them, and they seemed interesting. I wasn't sure yet. I didn't really know them in any way, but because of the recommendation from that guy, I said, okay, I'll join. And I became the first employee at lightrun. And lightrun essentially created a product. I wrote most of the stuff there, not the agent, but the server, the plugin, and all of the wiring there, related to developer observability, which is essentially a form of observability that works kind of like a debugger. Up until now, it wasn't the first in the field, but I think we did something that's most closest maps to debugging in production. And it's essentially a production debugger without all the faults of debugging in production. That means you can debug at scale, you are secure, and you can monitor everything and have the same control as any other observability solution. And it's kind of, instead of typical observability solutions that are mostly designed for DevOps people, this is more for developers, for things like a typical bug that you would solve with a breakpoint or something like that. You would solve it directly from your IDE by placing monitoring that will give you the right, really refined result. So you can put a snapshot, which is like a breakpoint, but it doesn't stop, it doesn't break execution. and get a stack trace with all the variable values and everything like that. And you can make it conditional, so only a specific user would give you that information. So if a user complains about a bug in production, you can actually debug it. And we built that, and it took off. The company is doing really, really, really well. And I worked there for a while, and eventually, the company grew really, really fast. They got lots of money, and they did investment properly, and they grew really fast. And at some point, it became tiring for me, and I was about to quit because when a company grows that a PR takes like a week to merge, that's when you need to leave. And so I decided I was going to leave, but then they suggested I'd become a developer advocate. And I said, okay. And I started doing developer advocacy, which was a new experience for me, although technically, historically, I always did conferences and talks and books and blogging and everything. It's not something new in that sense, but I never did it as a job. And I kind of like it, doing that. I no longer do it. I'm no longer at lightrun, so I'm objective. And one of the things we said, because what we're building is essentially a debugger, I should write about debugging. So I started writing a lot of my experience about debugging, about troubleshooting, about observability, about all of these things that I learned over the years. And as I wrote a lot of that material and did videos and everything, a guy from Apress contacted me and said, I think there's room for a book about debugging. Do you want to pitch something about that for me? And I've already been mulling doing that for some time. And because he approached me, I really like that. I think it's really important when you're publishing a book to have the publisher on your side and be as enthusiastic as you are for the subject matter. And that was an important thing for me. So I started working with him and actually did the book and wrote it. And the annoying thing is, as I was nearing the end of the book, when I think he was in Apress for 20-something years, and he quit just as I was close to finishing the book. So, the most important part of book production is the end, essentially the marketing and everything, getting the word out. And now he's not there, and it's kind of I don't have anyone in Apress anymore that's an advocate for me, which is an important part in any endeavor like this. So it's kind of a bummer. But the book itself, during the writing at least, he was there and was very supportive and active as part of that. And so the book was mostly pretty easy to write because I've been creating a debugger for the past few years. And even before that, working on JVMs, I did a lot of JDWP and all of that sort of work. So it's mostly just, a brain dump of a lot of the stuff that I've been doing. Also as a consultant, as you go to companies and run into the worst problems possible. So all of the tricks and things that we do. And I looked at debugging books in general to get a sense of what's already available. And the picking is very slim. There are a few books, but not that many that are actually about debugging. And most of them are very, very academic in their approach. They look too much at the theory, and those that do look at the tools tend to be very old in some cases,
that's what I wanted to say. There's actually no books. So it's really interesting, fresh topic. So your book is unique, I would say.
Yeah, there aren't many books in this subject. And the problem is it's a very amorphous subject. Debugging is a different experience every time. And the theory is the theory of debugging does exist, and it's something that is academically discussed, but it's also not subject for an entire book, although some people did write entire books about that theory. I think they're mostly very repetitive. And I didn't want to write that. I don't like books like that.
question back to lightrun. So you spend time writing Java code there at lightrun?
Yeah. I literally wrote the implementation of lightrun because I was the first developer that wasn't a founder.
What is lightrun? So if you buy lightrun, what do you get?
So the way it's a developer observability tool. So you get a backend server either in SaaS or installed on premise. And it essentially manages all the agents. You get a Java agent that you connect to the VM, to either Java, or it also supports Node, Python, and I think now also .NET. And you can essentially connect the agent to your runtime and run with that agent. Then the runtime connects to the lightrun management server. And you, from your IDE, either Intellij or Visual Studio Code, you can connect to the management server and essentially perform observability operations. So one example would be placing a snapshot, and then you get something that's very similar to a breakpoint, but it doesn't break. So in production, if you'd put a breakpoint on a remote debugging, it would stop the production. This isn't something you want to do. It might also take up too much CPU, which would also hurt production. So lightrun runs in a sandbox. It prevents you from modifying code, so you don't get actual access to production. Production is still secure. And you can essentially, and it also throttles you from adding too much observability information. So if you take too much CPU, it sort of shuts you down and keeps the server running smoothly. But it gives you a stack trace with all the variable values and everything that you need, and lets you do it conditionally. It also lets you inject logs into production. So if you forgot to add a log in a particular line and you see a bug and you say, wait, I wish there was a log right here to tell me what happened here, you can inject it dynamically and then it will appear. You can add metrics to measure the time it takes between line X and line Y, or the time it takes to execute a method, all sorts of things like that you would normally do in a debugger. But at production and at scale, it's really difficult. So one of the things you can do, you can not just add it to one server in production, you can add it to a tag, which groups together several server instances, and then get results that are compounded. And that way, if a user might hit one server here and another server there, you can actually get the results regardless of which one he hit. And that way you can actually debug production.
This is useful. And what's also useful, you will maybe could see whether, the load balancer is not properly configured. Was it also so in production?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can see everything. You can see things like, normally in an observability solution, you can see if someone uses the web service. But this tells you if a web service is being used. Lots of times you're in the ID, you're looking at an if statement. Does anyone ever reach the else statement here? Ever? Place a counter and you can see exactly how many people in production reach the else statement, right? You can even say, wait, does anyone from this country or any user of this type ever reach that else statement? No problem. Place a counter, answer that. You can say, okay, wait, does this thing ever happen? And if so, what's the state? Who calls this this code? Place a snapshot, which is like a breakpoint. Get that information. And it's essentially, lots of times when we're trying to debug something that's complex, that we need to essentially, one of the first things we need to do is reproduce the problem. But that problem is already happening in production. And this sort of lets us skip that issue of reproducing the problem because we already have the reproduction, right? We just need the information. That's why we don't want to reproduce. So lightrun helps you skip that stage of reproducing and fix instantly. And with problems of production, the scale lots of times is the problem. So reproducing some of these things is nearly impossible locally. And you need to do all sorts of tricks to reach that stage. But with observability, you can sort of skip ahead. And up until now, observability was this huge and powerful tool for DevOps and not for developers. We kind of were segregated away from production, which is a shame. We also need to support production and fix things there. And it's an important step in the right direction, I think. And lots of big companies I know are using lightrun, huge companies. And I think in some cases, I talked to vendors who have no other way to debug these things, because with microservices, the situation sometimes exists where they don't have a local production environment where they can reproduce things. They can only write a unit test or go to production. They don't have anything in between. Sometimes staging, and that's even lucky, and they can't debug staging either. So the only way they can debug is through observability and through tools like lightrun, which is both sad to one degree. I'm very much for local debugging, but if you don't have that, then it's a crucial tool for some companies who are addicted to it.
Interesting project, and the hold replacement reminds me of the debugging capabilities we already have, right, with debuggers, so we can replace code. So this is similar, and it also reminds me of
no, it doesn't have code replacement. There's injection of logs only. The environment runs in a sandbox, so there's no dynamic code replacement for security reasons, right? Theoretically, we could do that, but we don't want that option even. So it wouldn't pose a security threat. The only injection is of logs, nothing else.
Okay.
So you can add a new log, and it's and that's that. And this is an important part of it.
And you say sandbox. What means sandbox? I mean, is it like a specific production deployment, or?
Yeah, specific system for production. So the way lightrun works is that when we get bytecode, that's essentially, for instance, if you add a conditional breakpoint, okay? So I can put a condition saying x equals 5, which will assign 5 to x, right? That, or even make a condition like method 5, close bracket, and that's a Boolean method, for instance. But it also changes the state of the virtual machine because I gave it 5 as an argument. So one of the things lightrun does is first it reviews the bytecode. And if the bytecode has too many calls or has a call that changes state of a field of something like that, the call fails, right? So it will actually not let you add an action like that includes a condition like the one I described. And this is part one of the sandbox. It doesn't let you do any state changes. The second part is that bytecode doesn't run in the JVM itself. It runs in a special smaller JVM built within lightrun itself. And that specific JVM has limits. It won't do all sorts of things. So it can't really go into the wider JVM or use an exploit to elevate privileges, because the privileges literally aren't written there. They're part of lightrun itself. So a developer who uses this is also limited, because part of the problem here isn't external attacks against something like lightrun. It isn't exposed externally. It's internal company security. Like 60% of hacks are inside the organization. So I've talked to at least one I talked to quite a few companies where they do remote debugging into production. And this to me is negligent at a level that you wouldn't believe. And I'll put aside, all of the risks and everything. And, there's lots of problems related to that. But the biggest one of all is a liability. You could literally be sued for negligence and based on GDPR and all sorts of laws like that. And rightfully so, because if an employee places a breakpoint on the user login code, he can get all the usernames and passwords of every user that tries to log into the system, and unencrypted and everything. And it can be binary code. You can still place a breakpoint, obviously. And this is a huge, huge, huge danger that people essentially expose themselves. And because 60% of attacks against organizations are from the inside, from an employee of the organization, it's a crime to debug in production, to leave JDWP port open is negligent at a level you can believe. And essentially an observability solution isn't like that because everything is logged. So even if someone does try to do something negligent or malicious, you'd see that in the logs and you won't be able to delete it. And besides that, you can have block lists, which block people from placing snapshots in specific files or specific areas. PI reduction, which helps you limit what they push to the logs and all sorts of things like that. That prevents
PI is
the
personal
sort of
identification, right? PI
exactly.
Yeah.
Personal identifiable information is things like credit cards and things like that. That if you, those who listening who don't know, if you write something like a credit card number into the log by mistake, which is a mistake people can sometimes make, then you're violating the PCI standard rules and might get your right to process credit cards revoked because of something like that. And also you'd be in violation of laws like regulations like GDPR, etc. So this is really dangerous. You don't want to do that by mistake. And there's tools like PI reduction, which detect things like credit cards and that sort of information and implicitly remove them from the logs if you accidentally made that mistake, which you can, just write in the username, and by mistake, the user has a cached credit card number within a hash table within the user, something like that happens. So lightrun has PI reduction, and other tools also have that. You check your logger.
This lightrun reminds me, this is like interactive Java mission control with some, business background. So it scans is not, because Java mission control interactivity would be too powerful. So it's like, a hardened JMC, Java mission control.
It's exactly like the experience of working with a debugger. You place snapshots and logs, which are like tracepoints or logpoints. And it's sort of like working with a debugger.
But if you get millions of requests per second, you cannot just stop at any time. So there is like the
you never stop.
The breakpoint is like
there's no breakpoint. It's snapshot.
Exactly. And
but you get stack trace, and it looks just like you get a stack trace that's traversable, just like a debugger stack trace with variable values and everything. And you see it the way it's rendered in Intellij and VS Code is exactly like the debugger user interface because it's built for developers. It's not built for DevOps. So you essentially traverse the things exactly in the same way.
But it's interesting project, and the website looks great. So lightrun, it's an interesting one.
I'm sure they'll be happy to hear that.
Yeah, it looks amazing. So to our listeners, just take a look at this. What you remembered me of, it is a predecessor of JMC. But do you know Chronon project?
Yeah.
This is a very old one. I don't know why. If you started to explain lightrun, I remember. I think I was looking on the website. It looks by Nokia sponsored. It should be really old. But Chronon was it's more like a JMC, Java Mission Control. So this is DVR for Java, says. So I will have to investigate whether they are alive because it looks interesting. Chronon systems.
Yeah. So time travel debugging, which is the genre where Chronon sort of came through, is kind of seeing a revitalization to some degree. There are several interesting tools related to that, and I'm a big believer in that field. So time travel debugging is about running the application supposedly normally, but collecting all this telemetry from the application. And then you can sort of debug the application in all sorts of interesting ways. Like there's tools like that display flowcharts of how your application executed. And then you're looking at a visualization of the execution of the application. And you can see how it behaved through the way. And if the diagram makes sense to you. And there's a great example of that in Intellij IDEA that not everyone is familiar with. Which is they have a special debugger for streams. I know you use Visual Code and not Intellij. For debugging, I would strongly recommend using Intellij because it's so much better. Mostly because VS Code chose to be simple, intentionally. Because Visual Studio actually has an amazing debugger. And in Visual Studio Code, I think they tried to simplify a lot of the ideas there. So one of the things that Intellij IDEA has is a stream debugger where you can actually go through the stages of a Java stream, Java 8 stream.
This is what I know. This is amazing.
An element is
so
transformed.
You can put a breakpoint in a filter expression, for instance, right? So inside
Better.
the chain. Yeah.
Before the chain, you put the breakpoint before the chain, and then there's a special button, and you click that button, and you can actually see all the stages expanded in and linked, and you see this object translates to that object, and you see a line between them, and you see how the map and the filter and how the things get removed and things translate from that to this, and you can go back and forth and look at all of the steps and understand what's wrong with a particular stream expression. It's a fantastic tool. It has some pitfalls, like if you have external influences, it just doesn't work and gives a generic error, all sorts of things like that. But it's inspired by time travel debugging, which again, big subject and lots of interesting startups there. But
also
it's still kind
of
flaky. Yeah,
also
there's a chapter on time travel debugging. And also about the stream debugger there. That's mentioned in the first chapter. But I've got to warn you about time travel debugging. It's kind of a letdown because lots of the tools there are kind of flawed. The market is, I think if I'd write the book 3 years from now, maybe second edition, the story will be completely different. But at this particular point in time, a lot of these tools aren't ready yet. For instance, I've been talking a lot to a company called AppMap, which I suggest you check out. They have a very interesting solution where you can essentially translate Java runtimes into charts. And you just run the application, you get charts. And it's a fantastic solution on paper. But getting it to run, getting it through all the nuances of every Java API and how it behaves and trying to get it working, it would still require a bit of effort. I think in a year or so, they'll probably have the kinks ironed out and it would be fantastic. But at this particular point in time, if you're just trying it, be ready for, some growing pains because it's a relatively new concept.
It looks
but
nice.
I think
so I'm looking at it right now.
It's fantastic.
For Visual Studio Code and for JetBrains for Intellij, they have plugins and the chart looks really nice. So I put it also to the show notes.
Yeah, it's a very cool tool. And this is another example of what time travel debugging can offer us moving forward. And
maybe we should start today because it's also advanced time. Just at start, I think we have to meet again to go more deeply. But just the basics, I would say even Visual Studio Code has some tricks, right? So the breakpoints is a no-brainer. I mean, but already, which are a little bit more advanced, is you can have a breakpoints which logs. It doesn't stop. You can have a logging expression there. This can be already useful.
Logpoint and tracepoint. Yeah.
Tracepoint. Okay, this is called tracepoint. And this is available everywhere, but it is underused among developers. So this is what I like to do before I write system or print line.
That's the one thing Visual Studio Code did better than Intellij. It made tracepoints, log points more discoverable by developers. But even for that, there's more features around log points, trace points in Intellij. So the capabilities, I have actually a blog post from a few weeks back, maybe a month or so ago, where I give 16 things that Intellij IDEA has that Visual Studio Code doesn't have in the context of debugging. And there's a table and everything there that sort of shows some of these things. And that's one of the reasons in my book I only talked about Intellij, because lots of the things I mentioned there just didn't exist in Visual Studio Code.
No problem. I have also license, actually, the complete toolbox license of all Intellij tools. So no problem. I just wanted to mention that the trace points exist everywhere. So if it exists in Visual Studio Code, it also exists in Eclipse. And this is just underused, feature, I would say. Because instead of writing 100%. System or print line, you can put, trace points, and there's like a expression language where I can say I would like to log this thing, and this is actually pretty nice.
And they can be conditional. That's a really nice part about them. You can also, in IntelliJ, you can group them, and then if you're switching branches constantly, you can turn them off and on, and essentially get logging to suddenly appear. If you're in the middle, switching context and going back, you don't need to suddenly add all of the logging back. You can kind of keep it. There's lots of tricks like that we can leverage. And I have talks about that. I have videos and the book itself, obviously. So, and it's all, that particular part is completely free, by the way, in my website if people want to learn those capabilities.
Yeah, but now we're talking. So we have trace points. And another thing, I don't know what to call it, is like automatic breakpoint on exceptions. So maybe this is like automatic breakpoint.
So,
what is the
exception breakpoints?
Exception breakpoints.
Exception breakpoints. But so in exception breakpoints, the thing is that they suck by default. Okay. And this is something people don't, and they suck in Visual Studio Code all the time. IntelliJ has a solution for that. The thing is, if you run...
Are you working now for JetBrains?
No, although I did blog quite a bit about that. And but, well, it's not that as if we have that many alternatives. Eclipse is hard for me to use. Yeah. And essentially it's either that or this. And NetBeans I used to be very big on it, but not enough users by now.
Yeah, but
it's great.
I think the NetBeans debugger was great.
Yeah, it was great. I like a lot of things about NetBeans.
Yeah, was
the
great.
Debugger in IntelliJ is better because it lets you embed values directly in the UI, which is fantastic. And last I used NetBeans, I didn't have that. But NetBeans is great. As a Sun guy, I worked with NetBeans until just recently. I eventually left it for IntelliJ mostly because that's what everyone uses, and I'd rather align with everyone than that. But one of the things that breakpoints on exceptions, the reason I said that they suck is that by default, they stop on everything. The value of exception breakpoints is that they stop on everything. Because otherwise, you sometimes get an exception in the console and you don't even notice it. You restart the application, you kind of lose it. You never knew that you got the exception, which is something that happened to me quite often. But if you have a breakpoint on all exceptions, you'll run into the exception, you will see the problem instantly and fix it. The problem is that if I do that, then things inside the JDK will suddenly start stopping for you. Start stopping isn't the right word, but will trigger for this case.
Starting, maybe.
Yeah.
It's always fun.
I think in Hebrew it sounded better, but that's an excuse.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, so these breakpoints kind of hit a lot and create a noise that you can't work with, mostly because things like java.net URL try to parse headers, and because they use integer parsing, then the only way is to catch the number format exception and things like that. The thing is that IntelliJ has...
So what you're saying now is that because the JDK libraries are throwing, lots of exceptions...
Logical exceptions.
Doesn't matter, like a parse exception, because they cannot parse, a string to int, you get an exception and it stops. But this is no issue, actually, there, right?
Exactly. And there's lots of these. And exactly. And they happen all the time. And I can't blame the JDK, because back then that's the only option that the Java API allowed. So... it makes a lot of sense, but it's problematic. So there's a solution for that. And there's an option. I show it in my blog post about that. There's a blog with exception breakpoints that don't suck. And the thing is that you place a breakpoint and you select to filter based on package names where the exception is caught. And you can just strike out the Java packages and the Sun packages. And once you do that, exception breakpoints on all exceptions work just as you would expect them to work.
But this was available in NetBeans as well. Specific. In NetBeans?
Yeah, in NetBeans.
There was a filter. I don't know Visual Studio Code. I didn't try this yet because my code is always exception free. But I would try it with Visual Studio Code. In NetBeans, I knew because you could exclude all the exceptions, and I use NetBeans all the time. And Visual Studio Code, I didn't try it. So we have
anyway.
Already
it should be the default.
Yeah, breakpoint, tracepoint, and exception How we call that? Exceptional breakpoint.
Also, exception breakpoint and field watchpoint.
And watchpoints. Now, watches. Watches are interesting. So what is a watch?
No, that's not a watch. Field watchpoint. That's a different thing.
Field watchpoint. So what is a field watchpoint?
So you can place what seems like a breakpoint on a field, but it isn't a breakpoint. It's a watchpoint because you place it on the field itself, but it will stop every time the field is accessed. So you can define it to only stop on read, only on write, or on both. And essentially, it would stop not at the point of the field watchpoint, but rather in the point in the code that changes that field or that reads from that field. So if, for instance, you have a case where a value is read from a field and you want to know who does that, you can just place a watchpoint and see who does that. The same thing is true if you want to know who changes that field. Place a watchpoint and you can see who does that actual physical change. And it's really convenient. So that's
which means we could just write now public fields now and use debugger to find out what happens.
That totally works. You no longer need encapsulation for debugging.
Yeah.
But you do need it for good code.
Yeah. I contributed once to Toplink, and I wrote nice Java code with private fields, whatever. And they say, okay, this is a nice contribution, but this is not how we write. It's like, why not? This is too slow. And they just remove private, remove getters and setters. Everything was public. It was like, it looked like C, but it was fast. So interesting. And now about watches. What is then difference between field watch and watch?
So the watch area is you can actually watch a field, which is different from a watch point, obviously. And you've got lots of capabilities within the watch area where you can see the values that the ID deems as interesting for you. But the thing that I love about the watch area personally is rendering. So one of the things that people don't really understand is what do we see in the watch area? Now, normally what we see is sort of an interpretation by the IDE of what's available there. So it's usually just, if it's an array, it will just show us the size of the array and the elements within it. If it's an object, it will show us the fields of the object. But usually, when the field is minimized, it shows you the toString value of the object. Now, the thing is that Intellij has a thing called renderers, in which you can override the behavior of that area. Now, this isn't something that I can really describe in a podcast, but I showed a demo where you can take a JPA entity and essentially have it say the entity X has and point it at a repository for the entity. And it shows you the repository has 4 elements in it. And then when you expand the repository, it shows you the actual content of the table as entities. And that's, as a person debugging JPA code, it's like looking at the table itself. And the nice thing is it doesn't have any production impact because, if you make toString that includes all the data, you might impact production because, we sometimes log objects and do all sorts of things like that. And the toString value might become a hindrance. But renders don't have that problem because they're only an
anecdote regarding toString in entities. What I saw, they used a specific framework to have nicer toStrings. Jakarta Commons Lang, I think, with toString. And they were proud of it. But if you have a cycle, also bidirectional, bidirectional relation between
it will fetch all the data.
There was actually an endless loop of toStrings. So this is also fun. So toString is also an area of investigation because I see lots of reflection going on, lots of framework which is absolutely not necessary, I would say. A cleaner toString, which is even tested in unit tests, is better. It has to speak to me. There's no value, to dump everything. And in most cases, if you enable Heisenberg effect, right? So if you enable everything in production, everything slows down and the problem disappears. So I think you are also talking about logging and tracing in your book a bit?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
And also another tool, maybe, so as cliffhanger, memory analyzer from SAP, you know it?
So I don't know the memory analyzer from SAP, but I do talk about memory debugging in IntelliJ IDEA. So
of course.
There's some capabilities there for memory debugging and And I also
I
talk
think
about
you are on the
memory
verge,
tracing.
to become a JetBrains employee. So it seems like.
I don't think they can afford me.
Okay, but it's like an open question. So
Yeah.
I have to invite you back just to talk about debugging, if you like. So I mean, we covered now some basics, and then we can cover a little bit more. What I'm also interested, logging, especially, how to write beautiful logs and memory, and more like,
Yeah.
And also, I didn't even touch on this because it's too interesting. Your blog post regarding monolith and microservices, what I saw, because there's also some discussion here. So I'm curious about your opinion about that. But I actually what I like about that. So the listeners maybe also express their thoughts about that. So your entire path is like the debugging is just the natural way to go for you, right? So you work the entire career with low level stuff. With the with JVM. So debugging is, as you said, it's just a brain dump, just to think how to explain the things properly. Actually, this is the huge effort. It's nice. Where people can buy this book, and the problem I have with you're writing another book about Java 21 features. So we have to finish the series of this one before the next one starts. So where people can buy your debug agent, debug agent everywhere. So I reveal this right now, right? Debug agent.
Debugagent.com. Yeah.
And this you can just
got the links for everything. And
and should people prefer to buy book from your website or Amazon?
So technically, I'm not a big fan of Amazon, but I can tell you that, when you buy from Amazon, you essentially help with the sales rank. But one thing I've got to warn people about buying books from Amazon, they have this thing where scamsters essentially buy the digital book, print through the Amazon printing service, and essentially sell it for cheaper. And Amazon promotes them because the book is cheaper. So you're buying a lower grade copy. And this is true for all technical books, by the way. If you're buying a book from Amazon and you see that it looks cheaper, sometimes it's just literally a guy who bought the book, sells it as a new condition.
Okay.
And it's really just printed at low quality and sold, obviously cheaper, and no one else gets paid other than the scammer. And Amazon promotes that. It's a common practice.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only in some circles starting to get out, and it's very popular for technical books because it's smaller publications that can't really sue Amazon at scale. So the scammers kind of use that.
So better, everyone should buy the book on your website, from your website.
It's
or
from,
two books.
Acres
one book from
is
Amazon
one
for the index, and the other one as a backup from the website. This would be the best possible situation. Or at least if someone
I'll take
gets,
one. I'm good.
If someone
no need to kill too many trees.
Yeah, if someone buys a book,
buy digital,
fake one, then they should complain and buy digital, of course.
Yeah, digital I think is best because then it doesn't let the scammers use it, and it helps the trees, which I'm a fan of. I love physical books, but I can't really.
Back then, I also published
killing the
books.
forests.
The digital edition, the problem was always formatting. Code formatting is always a little bit challenging.
Yeah,
in the digital.
yeah. I'm not a fan either.
Yeah,
yeah. I also prefer the physical ones because I'm old. But yeah,
not old. I would say it is fun sometimes, to walk away from the computer and have something offline. We don't have, because it's stupid. We have our huge machines or whatever, and sit and read a book on a computer is a waste of energy, time, or whatever, right? So something like Kindle device,
stuff like
Kindle,
that.
Kindle device works. Something like paper device works, but it is very on iPad and all overpowered devices is not appropriate, I would say.
Yeah.
Thank you a lot. So debug agent.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time.
See you.